Tamar Winokur. This would not be happening if it weren't for Gila Fine, who is standing here before you. Gila, with the long list of accomplishments, if I just start listing them, we'll be here all night. So I'm going to keep it short. Recent winner of the Rabbi Sachs Book Prize. So we can all give her a round of applause for having just won that in the last couple of weeks. And was editor-in-chief of Magid, which is a subsidiary of Koren publishers, which we all love and know, especially because they're on the bookshelves over there for the Sidurim that anyone who comes here to daven davens out of every week. Best Sidur ever, small plug. And was the editor-in-chief for Magid for full Shemitah cycle for 7 years, and teaches at Pardes among a long list of accomplishments. And the next one will be that we get to hear her speak. So Gila, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm assuming that everyone on all the devices can hear me. I'm assuming that you can hear me all the way at the back. Amazing. I am going to thank you for having me. I've never been to Arizona before. I landed like 2 hours ago, and I'm flying out in 2 hours. So this is really a flying visit to come and speak to all of you. I want to echo the thanks to Tamar for making all this happen. All right, so The Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic, Rereading the Women of the Talmud, which is my new book. As I say in the book, this book really begins 3 days before my 12th birthday. I was visiting my grandparents in London, where I did not grow up, despite the accent. My whole family had gone out to the Science Museum for the day, and I was left behind with a pile of my grandfather's books and strict instructions to write my bat mitzvah speech. Do not know why anyone thought that was a good idea, but that is what my parents decided to do. Not knowing much about anything, I picked up the first book on the pile, which was the Book of Legends, a collection of the stories of the Talmud organized according to theme. And I opened to the theme women because I figured bat mitzvah. 3 stories in, I felt a little bit uncomfortable. By the 10th, I was in tears, sobbing as only a nearly 12-year-old can. Yeah, I was so hurt. I was so deeply offended that the rabbis could have such a low opinion of me and my kind. The women in their stories were weak. They were irrational. They were greedy and petty and promiscuous and vain. One of the sources read, when woman was created, the devil was created with her. So women were the mother of all vice. 3 days before your bat mitzvah, not the best time to lose your religion, but that is what happened to me that day. I cobbled together some quotes from my speech, but nothing was the same after that. The simple faith of my childhood was gone, and in its place were pain and confusion and doubt. I struggled to make peace with the religion I so loved, knowing that its founding fathers thought about me the way they did. I spent years questioning, searching, reading anything I could get my hands on. After high school and National Youth Service, I went to seminary to study Talmud, which was a subject forbidden to me growing up. But it wasn't until I went to university to study literature that I found the answers I was looking for. Learning how to read Talmudic stories as Talmudic stories ought to be read, I discovered these narratives are not at all what they originally seemed to be. That there is a great deal more to the women of the Talmud than initially meets the eye. And the rabbis had some surprising, so as not to say some surprisingly proto-feminist ideas of marriage, sex, childbirth, and what it means to be a woman in the world. It took over a decade of intense religious struggle, but the stories of the Talmud, which had so upset me at 12, ended up becoming my constant study and my greatest joy. And this book is a result of that struggle. And to give you a bit of a sense of what I mean, I'd like to take you through the subject of the first chapter of the book, and that is the tale of Yalta, the shrew. Do not look at the source sheets. I did not tell you to look at the source sheets. I want to begin with that last word. What is, in fact, a shrew? That is not a rhetorical. Yes. Anyone? Shrew? Yes.
shrew is a high-pitched little woman that will have her way come hell or high water.
Ooh, very good. A shrill, high-pitched woman who will have her own way come hell or high water. Anyone want to add anything to that? And now, all right, good. Let's start with that. In its original sense, shrew is actually the name of a small mouse-like mammal known for its aggressive nature and venomous bite. In the 13th century, however, the term expands to refer to a shrill, high-pitched, stubborn woman known for her aggressive temper and venomous tongue. Now, the name might have appeared only in the 13th century, but the shrew herself did not. The archetype is actually a lot older, and we can find shrews snarling and scolding their way throughout the Western canon. And let's begin by looking at some of the shrews we know and love. Do not look at the source sheet. If you did, you can't play. Let's begin with the Bible. There is a classic example of the shrew in the Bible. Can anyone tell me who she is? Jezebel is an overreacherix, and if you want to know what that means, you have to read chapter 5 of my book. Vashti, exactly correct. Vashti, the great shrew of the Bible. You may now look at your source sheets. I'm going to actually begin with the book of Proverbs, which tells us, quote, "It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman." Contentious and angry woman, almost dictionary definition of the shrew. And then a couple books later, we have an example of one such contentious and angry woman in the character of the disobedient queen Vashti. Moving from biblical to rabbinic literature, stories in the Talmud will often appear in groups or clusters along a certain theme. And there is an entire story cycle in Tractate Yevamot devoted to the subject of shrews. Can I have a reader for number 3, please? Thank you.
Was constantly tormented by his wife. If he told her, "Prepare me lentils," she would prepare him peas. If he asked for peas, she would prepare him lentils. When his son grew up, he reversed his father's request to her. Rob said to him, "Your mother has improved." Kaya replied, "It was I who reversed your request to her." Rabbi was constantly tormented by his wife. Nevertheless, whenever he would find anything suitable, he would wrap it up in his shawl and bring it to me. Rob said to him, "But surely she is fermenting the master." He replied, "It is sufficient for us that they rear up our children and deliver us from sin." While Heruta was reading his son Rabbi the verse, "And I find more bitter than death the woman." His son asked, "Who, for instance?" His father replied, "For instance, your mother."
Notice one of history's ever first Yo Mama jokes right here in the Talmud. What can you tell me about the shrew from these 3 stories? What sort of woman is she? Obstinate, contrary, doesn't listen, good. 2 men, I'll take that. Anything else? Demanding, good. Let me ask you this. Who do we not see in these 3 stories? Her. An entire shrew story cycle, not one shrew to be found. All we have are the husbands, the poor, tormented husbands suffering patiently through the antics of their shrewish wives. Now, this is generally true of shrew stories everywhere. They will almost always be told through the perspective of the man. The point of view of the shrew herself is hardly ever there. Moving on, again, don't look at your source sheet, to classical. And by classical, I mean Greco-Roman literature. Who is the shrew of Greco-Roman literature? Are there any classicists in the house? So the great Greek philosopher Socrates, have we heard of him? Yes. Socrates was married to Xanthippe, and although there is no historical evidence of this whatsoever, every single time she is described in the literature, she is described as a shrew from hell. Would you continue to number 4, please? Thank you. Actually, we're going to skip that one. Let's go directly to the second one. The next one, Alcibiades.
Oh, Alcibiades sent to Socrates a large and beautifully made cake. Xanthippe, who was rather jealous of the giver, took it out of the basket and stamped upon it. Socrates only smiled and said, "Oh, now, my dear, you will not get a slice of it any more than I."
Thank you. Love the voice. Yeah, what can you tell me about the shrew from this story?
So
Compulsive, in what sense?
she's overtaken by her emotion.
She's overtaken by her emotion. Good. I want to say that this perhaps is the hallmark of the shrew. If I had to define it in one word, I would say the shrew is mad. And I use that word in the double sense. The shrew as a mad woman is both angry and crazy, raging and deranged. And notice how Socrates, very much like the rabbis of the Talmud, kind of puts up with his wife quite patiently. In the first source, which we didn't read, he says more or less exactly what Rav Chia said, which is, well, she's the mother of my children. What are you going to do? Moving on to some medieval shrews, perhaps the work which has given us more shrews per capita than any other in the Western canon is Arabian Nights. There are many shrews there. The most notorious probably is Fatima. We won't read it, but very quickly, Fatima is this terrible shrew who makes the life of her husband Maruf an absolute misery. One day she demands that he bring her home a cake. Again, it's a cake. Maruf goes out looking for a cake, but he's not a very rich man. He can't afford any of the cakes. And so at some point he finds a baker who takes pity on him because he's married to this really awful woman. And he says, you know what, take this cake home for free. So Maruf takes his cake home for free. But it's not the fancy cake that his wife wanted. So when she sees it, she flies into a fit. She throws it in his face and she knocks out one of his teeth. What can you tell about the shrew from this story? Vindictive, good. Ungrateful, very good. Anything else? Out of control, good. And I would say, again, perhaps a defining characteristic, violent. The shrew is a violent woman. Sometimes it's verbally violent, sometimes it's physically violent, oftentimes it is both. Another famous medieval shrew comes to us courtesy of the medieval mystery plays. So one thing the medievals love to do during their religious holidays is stage plays based on different biblical stories. One story that they were particularly fond of was the tale of Noah and the flood. Now, Noah's wife, who barely even gets a mention in the Bible, takes center stage of these plays as an absolute shrew from hell. She refuses to believe that there's going to be a flood. She hits, kicks, curses, and sits on poor Noah until she has to be dragged kicking and screaming onto the ark. Moving further down to early modernity, we have who is arguably the most famous shrew in all of Western literature. Lady Macbeth, if anything, is an overreacherix, and again, I refer you to chapter 5 in my book. Good. Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. Caterina Minola, can I have a Petruchio, please? Guys, it's your chance to read Shakespeare. You'll do Petruchio? Can I have a Caterina, please? Go. Number 7.
Now, sit on me. They're two there, and so are you. Women are made to dare, and so are you. That's the shade of me. Come, you wasp. Okay, you are too angry. If I be waspish, then beware of my thing. Who knows not where a wasp does wear his sting in his tail? In his tongue. Whose tongue? Yours. If you talk of tail, and so fair enough. What? With my tongue in your tail? Nay, come again, good Kate. I am a gentleman. That I try.
Bravo. Very nice. 100 years after Shakespeare, William Congreve coins the motto for shrews everywhere when he says, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Moving further down, late modernity, the 19th century, many shrews. We do not have time to discuss them all, but I will mention one, American one, just to prove to you that the shrew has arrived on these shores. The most famous American short story. This is legit the most famous. It's called the most famous American short story. Why do I have to tell you this? Sorry. Rip Van Winkle. That's not American. Rip Van Winkle is the most famous. Okay, Google it and read it. Homework for after tonight's class. Generally, what people do know about Rip Van Winkle is that he falls asleep and sleeps, basically travels into the future, sleeps through the American War of Independence, and wakes up when America has freed itself from British rule, which you guys seem to think is a better state of affairs. What people generally do not know is that the reason that Rip ends up traveling to the future is to get away from his wife, who again has made his life an absolute misery. Now, let me ask you this. What is the genre of the shrew story? Think about all the examples we've looked at and how you've responded to them. What kind of stories are these? Comedic. The shrew narrative is a comedy. The reason for this, without going too deeply into theory, is that comedy is a product of incongruity. Bringing together two things that generally do not belong together is what produces the comedic effect. So a cat playing the piano is funny because cats generally do not play pianos. A violent woman in this respect is like a piano playing cat. She is incongruous, therefore she is humorous. There is something inherently funny about a woman who hits and kicks and curses. But the final shrew I want to briefly talk about before getting to the shrew of the Talmud Yalta comes to us in a dramatic rather than comedic setting, and that is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Now, if you've not read Jane Eyre, and you would like to one day read Jane Eyre, and I highly recommend it, I'm going to ask that you stop your ears for the next 60 seconds or so, because I am going to spoil the novel for you. So, spoiler alert issued. The secret at the heart of Jane Eyre is that Mr. Rochester, Jane's love interest, is in fact already married, and his wife, Bertha Mason, is a madwoman locked away in the household attic. Now, this is the shrew taken to a mad and murderous extreme, as Bertha a number of times tries to kill her husband and burn the house down. Can somebody please read number 10 for us? Thank you. Number 10.
In the deep shade, at the farther end of the room, a figure ran backward and forward. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It groveled seemingly on all fours. It snatched and growled like some strange wild animal. But it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face. Mr. Rochester flung me behind him. The lunatic sprang and grappled his throat viciously and laid her teeth to his cheek. He struggled. She was a big woman, in stature almost equaling her husband, and corpulent besides. She showed virile force, and the contest more than once she almost flung him.
Thank you. So this is the shrew. She is a mad woman, again, in the double sense of both angry and crazy, who flies into fits and attacks those around her. She is a wife of a timid and terrorized husband who puts up with her antics and does his best to appease her temper. And she is a comedic character whose story, told from the point of view of said suffering husband, features scenes of verbal abuse or physical violence, oftentimes both. And with that definition in mind, let us now proceed to the story of the great shrew of the Talmud, Yalta. Excuse me. Yalta is the Aramaic version of which Hebrew name? Yael, very good. She lives in 3rd century Babylon. She's generally believed to have been the daughter of the exilarch, essentially the leader of the Babylonian Jewish community, and the wife of Rav Nachman, one of the great scholars of his generation. Most significantly, Yalta is mentioned 7 times in the Babylonian Talmud, making her the most named woman in the entire Talmud. But of all the stories that we have about her, the one we are about to read is probably the most famous. It is also the first. It appears early on in Tractate Brachot, page 51b. This is number 1 in the source sheet, and I'd like to begin, as I generally like to begin when looking at the story in the Talmud, by reading the entire thing through beginning to end. So who is taking us through number 1, please? Thank you very much. I will be interrupting you all the time. Go. So at this time, I warned you, at this time, the Jewish centers of Israel and Babylon, There were two rabbinic centers, one in Israel, one in Babylon, and they would communicate via nechute, or rabbinic messengers, people who would travel backwards and forwards between Israel and Babylon and teach the rabbis in each community what the rabbis in the other community are saying. Ula was a prominent Israeli sage who often traveled to Babylon on business. He was a merchant by profession, and so he acted as one such rabbinic messenger. And we are told that on one of his trips through Babylon, Ula is hosted by his friend and rabbinic colleague, Rav Nachman. Continue, please.
Said the grace after meals and handed the cup of blessing to Rav Nachman.
Thank you. So they have a meal, and then they say the blessing after the meal, which is traditionally recited over a cup of wine. Some people do it to this day on Shabbat. Some of you might be familiar with this custom from a Jewish wedding. You fill the cup, you say the blessing, and then you drink. Ula, as the guest, is given the honor of leading the blessing, so he drinks first. Then he hands the cup to the host of Nachman, who also drinks. Continue, please.
Rav Nachman said to him, "Master, please send the cup of blessing to Yalta." Ula responded, "So said Rabbi Yochanan, the fruit of a woman's body is blessed only from the fruit of a man's body, as it is written. You will bless the fruit of your body." Deuteronomy 7:13. It does not say the fruit of her body, but the fruit of your body.
Thank you. And then Rav Nachman says, please send the cup to my wife. The use of the verb send implies that Yalta is not actually at the table with the men, although she is close at hand. Ula sees this as a perfect opportunity to teach his Babylonian friend some words of Israeli Torah. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, the great rabbi back in Israel, women do not drink from the cup of blessing. Because the blessing in the cup, which is generally believed to be the blessing of childbirth, is transmitted to the woman through her husband. So it is enough that he drink and be blessed. A very classic example, which we've seen throughout history for the exclusion of women. Women do not need to take part in something or be represented in something because they can do so through the proxy of their husbands. Continue, please.
And wrote 400 stars in wine.
Thank you. All right, you see, you're laughing. It's a comedy. Yalta overhears this and flies into a fit. She storms up to the wine store not in the American sense of shop, but the storage house of the wine. And Madwoman in the attic that she is, she smashes 400 jars of wine. She is so vindictive and violent and angry, she doesn't even care that the wine she is destroying, remember Fatima and stepping on the cake? She doesn't even care that the wine she is destroying is her own. If she can't have wine, no one is having wine. Continue, please.
Rav Nachman said to him, "Let the master send her another cup."
Thank you. Okay, you didn't laugh at this, but this is actually the greater comedic moment. His wife has just smashed 400 jars of their wine, and all poor Rav Nachman can say is, please send her another cup, please, before she breaks anything else. So this is a thoroughly whipped husband. Let's read on.
He sent it to her with the message, "All that wine can be counted as a blessing."
Thank you. So Ula does send Yalta another cup, but he can't help it. He's a rabbinic messenger. He's got to teach something. So he sends it to her with a message. All the wine is equally blessed. Now, this is halachically true. If you say a blessing over a cup of wine, all the wine in the vicinity is considered blessed. And so Ula essentially is saying to Yalta, first of all, you're ignorant. You don't know the law. And second, if you did know the law, you would realize that you just completely overreacted. You could have drunk from any cup. You did not need this particular one, and there was no call for this violent outburst. Let's finish up.
She returned the answer, "Gossip comes from peddlers and lice from rags."
Thank you. I love this. It's one of the great comebacks in all the Talmud. Gossip comes from peddlers and lice from rags. You can almost see at the end of that. Do you know what I mean when I do that? Okay, thank you. My students keep telling me I can't pull it off because I'm not American. It's a weird final line. Scholars don't really know what to make of it. It's generally interpreted as Yalta trying to insult Ula any which way she possibly can. We know that Ula is a merchant, and so she's basically saying to him, You, Ulla, are nothing but a gossiping, rag-wearing, lice-infested peddler. All right, so far the story of Yalta, and it appears at face value that we have before us a classic shrew narrative. We've got the comedy, we've got the violence, both verbal and physical, we've got the whipped husband, and we've got the bad-tempered mad woman who doesn't get her own way and unleashes her fury at everything in her path. But I want to ask, as we must always ask when reading a story in the Talmud, is this really the story the Talmud is telling? Spoiler, the answer to that question is almost always no. One of the hallmarks of rabbinic storytelling is what I call in the book the false front. What these stories seem to be saying and what they are actually saying are often diametrically opposite. The rabbis construct their stories so as to deliberately mislead us, such that if we only read the story once, we will come away with the wrong idea. So rabbinic stories can never just be read, they must always be reread. Hence, rereading the women of the Talmud. And so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to reread the story of Yalta. And I want to begin our rereading of the story of Yalta with another rereading. A rereading of the story of the other mad woman in the attic, and I want to go back to Bertha Mason from Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was published in the 19th century, huge hit. About 120 years later, in the 20th century, British Dominican novelist Jean Rhys came along and said, do you know what? We don't know anything about Bertha Mason, save the fact that she is a mad woman in the attic. But no mad woman in the attic is a mad woman in an attic born. Something must have happened to get her to be this way. And so Jean Rhys decides to write her story. The result is the very beautiful, very poignant novel Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a prequel to Jane Eyre. It tells the story before Jane Eyre, the story of Bertha Mason's childhood as the daughter of a slave owner in post-emancipation Jamaica. After the emancipation, the natives turn on Bertha and her family. They kill her baby brother, they burn her house down, and they send her mother spiraling into madness. Can somebody please read number 12 for us? Anyone? Thank you.
How knew they would be, they were waiting for me under the sandbox tree. There were two of them, a boy and a girl. They looked so harmless and quiet, no one would have noticed the glint in the boy's eyes. Then the girl grinned and began to crack the knuckles of her fingers. At each crack, I jumped in my hand and began to sweat. I was holding the school book in my right hand and I shifted them to under my arm, but it was too late. There was a mark on the palm of my hand and a stain on the cover of the book. They closed in on me and started talking. The girl said, "Look, the crazy girl, you're crazy like your mother. Your aunt frightened to have you in the house. She sent you for the nuns to lock up. Your mother walked in, you could walk about with no shoes and stockings on her feet. She tried to kill her husband and she tried to kill you too that day you go to see her. She had eyes like zombie and you have eyes like zombie too. You don't want to look at me, and I did you look at me." She pushed me and the books I was carrying fell to the ground.
Thank you. And this, says Jean Rhys, this is what drives Bertha Mason to insanity. You crazy like your mother. Treat someone as if they are mad often enough, and they will eventually become so. A similar argument is made by 20th century theorist Susie Kaplow in an essay titled Getting Angry, which discusses the fraught relationship between women and anger. When men get angry, says Kaplow, they are indignant. When women get angry, they are irrational. And this too becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Treat a woman as if she is irrational, ill-tempered, and shrewish, and she will become irrational, ill-tempered, and shrewish. Would you carry on to 13, please, Tamar?
Women in our society deny the forthright expression of her healthy anger. Her attempts at physical confrontation seem ridiculous. Ladies do a slow burn, letting out their anger indirectly in catty little phrases, often directed against a third party, especially children. A woman has to learn to hold back her anger. It's unseemly, aesthetically displeasing, and against the sweet, pliant feminine image to be angry. And the woman fears her own anger. She is the great conciliator, the steadier of brought both moves out of her fear to quiet not only others' anger, but also her own. Small wonder that when the vacuum sealed lid burst off, the angry woman seemed like a freak out of nuts. Her frenzy is intensified by the shakiness of her commitment to her own anger. what if she's really wrong? What if the other person is right? Or worse, and this is the greatest fear, hits back with, you're crazy, I don't know what you're so mad about.
Thank you. And this, according to Kaplow, is how the shrew goes from angry to crazy, from raging to deranged. A woman who is mad is so easily turned into a mad woman. All that it takes is for someone to dismiss her as such. You're crazy, I don't know what you're so mad about. Precisely the response that Ula gives Yalta after she smashes all those jars of wine. Ula dismisses Yalta as a raging shrew. But is that really who she is? So let's review the evidence. I mentioned earlier that Yalta is referenced no fewer than 7 times in the Talmud. Let's look at some of these other stories and see if Yalta really is the shrew Ula accuses her of being. Can somebody please read the first source in number 14 for us?
He then took it to Rabbi, son of Rabbi, who told her that it was pure. But how could he act in this manner, seeing that it was taught, if a rabbi declared anything impure, another rabbi may not declare it pure? At first, he informed her that it was indeed impure. However, when she told him that every time she brings this kind of blood to Rabbi Bar Hana, he declares it pure, but that on the last occasion, he had a pain in his eye. Rabbi gave her his ruling that it was pure.
Thank you. So a little bit of background. This story is from Tractate Nida. It's an entire tractate in the Talmud devoted to the subject of menstruation. The tricky thing is that not every blood spot, not every spotting is considered menstrual blood. And so Yalta takes a blood spot of questionable nature to Rabbi Bar Hana, who tells her, yes, this is menstrual blood and you are impure and therefore you cannot have relations with your husband. And then Yalta makes the unusual and rather audacious decision to seek a second halachic opinion, which strictly speaking, you are not meant to do. But the Talmud validates her decision when it tells us that actually Rabbi Bar Hana couldn't see properly and was therefore incapable of rendering a halachic diagnosis in this case. What can you tell me about Yalta from this story? She thinks for herself, good.
Doesn't accept the first opinion.
She's independently minded. Anything else? She's careful what? She's careful to follow halakha. Very good. Yeah. Intuitive. Well, it's interesting because there are readings of this story that basically say that the whole point of this story in the Talmud is to show that women actually do know their own bodies best. So her intuition is over her own body. Anything else? She is very halachically knowledgeable. Remember when Ula says to her, you're ignorant, you don't know the law? Clearly, this is a woman who knows the law through and through. Yes.
Well, maybe this person can't actually see properly.
So she figures out that the rabbi can't see properly, and notice how very tactfully, very calmly, no tantrums, she simply seeks a second opinion, which makes her rather rational, I would say. All right, would you continue, right, you were reading, would you continue to the second source, please, in number 14?
Everything that the Torah prohibited is permitted a corresponding thing. It prohibited blood, it permitted liver. A menstruating woman, pure blood. The fat of domesticated animals, the fat of wild animals. Pork, the brain of a carp. The margin, the tongue of a fish. A married woman, the divorcee in her husband's lifetime. A brother's wife, a levirate bride. A Samaritan woman, a beautiful captive woman. I would like to eat milk and meat. Rav Nachman told the cooks, roast her and butter.
Thank you. For every law, says the Yalta to Rav Nachman, there is a loophole. We cannot have bloody meat, but we can have liver, which is a naturally bloody piece of meat. We cannot have pork, but we can have a shibuta. By the way, if any of you are curious about the taste of pork, All you have to do is figure out what a shibuta is and then find one and eat one, because apparently they taste exactly the same. I want to eat milk and meat. Find me the loophole for that. And Rav Nachman tells the cooks, roast her an udder, which is in fact the halachically permissible way to eat milk and meat. The Talmud tells us that if you have an udder, you open it up and you let the milk spill out, any milk that remains steeped within the flesh is halachically permissible. So you can all go and cook udders now for Shabbat. What can you tell me about Yalta from this source?
Very knowledgeable again.
So knowledgeable of the system, she kind of pushes the boundaries a little bit. Good. Anything else? Creative thinker. Good. Which again comes from having great knowledge. Anything else? How? Sorry?
Brave,
Brave. How?
because she's not only pushing and trying to push further, but also push further to someone who is known to be very knowledgeable.
So how would you characterize her relationship here with her husband?
Characterize her relationship? Trust?
Yeah, I think there's that they seem to have a good, mutually respectful marriage here. Good. Could you continue to the next source, please?
The exilarch would afflict Rav Amram with pious. They made him lie down in the snow. Yalta heard and took him into the bathhouse and bathed him till the water of the bathhouse turned the color of blood, and his flesh was covered with bright spots.
Thank you. So when the servants of the exilarch, again, the leader of the Babylonian Jewish community, wanted to torment Rav Amram the pious, were not entirely sure why they had it in for poor Rav Amram. Rashi suggests that he was simply annoyingly pious. They make him lie down in the snow and they give him frostbite. Yalta hears this and arranges for him to be taken to the bathhouse and gently nursed back to health. What can you tell me about Yalta from this source? She's compassionate. Good. Let's read one last story and notice how this story is going to be a direct parallel to our main story in number 1. Thank you.
Shmuel said, one should not make use of a woman. Rav Nachman said, she is a minor. Rabbi replied, Shmuel explicitly said, one should not make use of a woman at all, whether adult or minor. Rav Nachman said, with the metrics and rereading Yalta. Rabbi replied, Shmuel said, a woman divorces and declares to be her. Rav Nachman said, who are living here? Rabbi replied, Shmuel said, one should not send greetings to a woman. Rav Nachman said, who her husband? Rabbi replied, Shmuel said, one should not send greetings to a woman at all. His wife sent Rav Nachman a message. Conclude this business and let him go, lest he make you as an ignoramus.
Thank you. So notice the similarities between this story and our main one in number 1. In both cases, a guest shows up to the Rav Nachman Yalta household. In both cases, Rav Nachman requests that the guest acknowledge Yalta as the lady of the house. And in both cases, the guest, citing a higher halachic authority with more exclusionary views of women, refuses to do so. So 2 very similar stories, 2 diametrically opposite responses on Yalta's part. In this case, she doesn't throw any tantrums. She doesn't break anything. She doesn't curse anyone. She simply tiptoes over to her husband and says, get rid of him. He's embarrassing you. What can you tell me about Yalta from this story? Yeah. She's protective of her husband. Very good. So emerging from all of these stories, we have a portrait of a woman who is highly knowledgeable, extremely rational, compassionate, and deeply concerned for her husband's honor. So hardly your typical shrew. That's the broad context of the story. The next thing we have to consider is the immediate context of the story, the way the story appears within the greater Talmudic conversation, because you can learn a lot about the stories by the way the rabbis choose to frame them. So directly before our story in the Talmud is a halachic conversation of this cup of blessing, what this cup has to be, what you have to do with it. And there are 10 things the Talmud says you have to do with this cup. And then at the end of the list, the Talmud adds one possible 11th thing that you do and that is the final line in number 15. He sends it round to the members of his household so that his wife may be blessed. And then immediately the Talmud goes into telling us the story of Yalta and Ula. What can you tell me about the story from the way the rabbis choose to frame it? Ula is wrong. Yalta is right. Sharing the cup with one's wife is standard practice, at least in Babylon, and Yalta was absolutely right to expect it. So it seems that in this conflict between Ula and Yalta, the Talmudic editors are strictly on Yalta's side. Let's look at the other end of the framing of the story. How does our story end? Who is given the final words? Yalta. The men do all the talking throughout the story, but it is Yalta significantly who is given the last word. You can generally tell whose side the rabbis are on by who they choose to give the last word to. So it does seem from the way they frame the story that the rabbis are absolutely on Yalta's side. So we've looked at the broad context. We've looked at the immediate context. The next thing we have to do is do a close rereading of the text. And this time we're going to read it more closely and carefully. And unlike other shrew narratives, we're going to try and do it from the point of view of the woman herself. So who is rereading number 1 for us?
Ula was once at the house of Rav Nachman. He had a meal, said the grace after meals, and handed the cup of blessing to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said to the master, please send the cup of blessing to Yalta. Ula responded, so said Rabbi Yochanan, the fruit of a woman's body is blessed only from the fruit of a man's body. As it's written, he will bless the fruit of your body. It does not say the fruit of her body, but the fruit of your body.
Thank you. So, the story is a 3-act drama. I show in the book how most stories in Talmud naturally break into 3 acts, and this is the end of Act 1. Once again, Rav Nachman asks Ula to send the cup of blessing to his wife, and Ula explains that women don't need to drink from this cup because the blessing in the cup will be transmitted to the wife through her husband. Now, I want to claim that this is not just some sexist attempt to exclude women from the cup of blessing. Because if we read the story in context, and we spoke about the broad context and the immediate context, and now I want to speak about the historical context. If we read the story within its historical context, we find that the argument that Ula is making here is a basic biological fact. For most of the ancient world, the power of procreation belonged exclusively to man. It was man who created life through the generative force of his seed, whereas woman was merely an incubator who carried that life inside of her. There are many sources, we're not going to read them, but Greco-Roman biological writings and rabbinic writings, which were heavily influenced by them, again and again will refer to the woman as a receptacle or a vessel. And they will describe the womb as some sort of upside-down jar lying empty within the woman's body, hollow and waiting to be filled. And so in light of this very dominant biological theory, what Ula says makes perfect sense. Man is the primary agent of childbirth, and he alone should be blessed for it. Woman is ancillary at best, and she will receive the man's blessing when she receives the man's blessed seed into the vessel that is her womb. Let's read on.
Meanwhile, he also heard, and she got up in a passion, and went to the wine storehouse and broke 400 jars of wine.
Thank you. I'm going to claim that this is no temper tantrum. This is not Yalta breaking all the jars of wine out of some jealous spite. If I can't have wine, no one can have wine. This is a very clever, very sophisticated response to the biological argument that Ula has just made. Vessels aren't important, are they? Okay. Let's see how you do without vessels. I'm not going to touch the wine. I'm just going to deconstruct the vessels. And if vessels are so unimportant, it shouldn't make any difference now, should it? Let's read on.
But Malcolm said to him, let the master send her another cup. He sent it to her with the message, all that wine can be counted as a blessing.
Thank you. Once again, I want to claim that there is some serious subtext here, because if Ulla genuinely believed that all the wine is equally blessed, he would have said that the first time Rav Nachman asked him to send Yalta the cup. But Ulla understands perfectly well what Yalta has just tried to tell him, and he responds in kind. And to understand exactly what the subtext here, we have to look at the symbols in the story. There are two main symbols in the story. Can anyone tell me what they are? The vessels, what do they symbolize? The womb, the woman's womb, and the wine, which symbolizes the man's seed. Very good. By saying to Yalta, all the wine is equally blessed, you do not need to drink from this particular cup, Ulla is doubling down. Yes, vessels are not important. They are interchangeable. The only thing that is important is what is inside the vessel, i.e. the wine, i.e. man's seed. And yes, procreation absolutely is a male act. Let's finish up.
She returned to answer, gossip comes from peddlers and lies from rags.
Thank you. And so now that we've decoded the biological subtext of the story, I think we can make sense of this final line in a way that other scholars cannot. Again, if we look at the story within its biological context, in the ancient world, lice were believed to spontaneously generate. You do not need a mother louse and a father louse to create a little baby louse. Rather, lice were born out of the air, which is why the Talmud, again, under this biological influence, will say that you can kill lice on Shabbat since they're not considered a real animal. Remove the female from the procreative process, says Yalta to Ulla, and you might be able to generate lice. You might be able to reproduce gossip. But for any real act of procreation, you need both female and male, vessel and seed. Women may be vessels, but they are no less essential to the creation of life. And so now that we've reread the story of Yalta, we find that it is very different to the story we read at first. This is not a petty fight over a cup of wine. This is a principal debate over the power of procreation. This is not an outburst of verbal and physical violence. This is a highly intelligent argument in favor of women's reproductive worth. And this is not a shrew storming off in a tantrum. This is a rational, self-possessed woman who stays and fights the system from within. And this final point for me is Yalta at her most remarkable. At no point does Yalta say, I am not a vessel. The dominant biological tradition of her time decreed that women were vessels, and Yalta accepts that. But within that tradition, Yalta tries to carve out a space for herself. As such, Yalta for me is the ideal reader, and it is her strategy that I try to adopt as I make my way through the stories of the women of the Talmud in my book. Because not every tradition we find in the Talmud is going to sit well with our 21st century sensibilities. Some of them may strike us legitimately as difficult. There is a reason I cried 3 days before my bat mitzvah. And the point is not to reject these traditions. The point is, like Yalta, to accept them as our own and try and carve out a space for ourselves within them. And if we do that, we might just find, as we did with the story of Yalta, that these traditions might not be so far from what we believe in after all. I will say one more thing and then I will end. I say in the book very early on that women for the rabbis were the ultimate other. And when the rabbis tell a story of a woman, 9 times out of 10, they are telling a story of an other, as a way of imparting to us their ethics of otherness, how to treat the other in our midst. And so the ultimate lesson of this story, I believe, is an ethical one. Ulla dismisses Yalta as a raging shrew. And so do generations of readers after him, who never bother to look at the story more closely or from her point of view. And dismissal, as we've seen, is the worst kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Katerina said, if I be waspish, best beware my sting. Treat me like a snarling, scratching, biting female, and I will be a snarling, scratching, biting female. Shylock, another famous Shakespearean, others said, "Thou callest me dog before thou hadst a cause, but since I am a dog, beware my fangs. Treat me like a heartless Jew monster, and I will be a heartless Jew monster, and I will demand my pound of flesh." We saw how Bertha Mason is mocked for being crazy until she is in fact driven mad. And the Talmud tells us the story of Timnah. Timnah, who was a Horite princess who more than anything wanted to convert and join the Jewish people. But our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, dismiss her as unworthy. And so Timnah goes off and gives birth to Amalek, arch enemy of the Jewish people. Dismiss someone as irrational or wicked or unworthy, and they will become the very thing you dismiss them for. This is a moral error very few of us avoid. We saw how men, through the archetype of the shrew, will sometimes dismiss women, but adults dismiss children all the time. We dismiss people whose culture we do not immediately understand. And these days, we dismiss just about anyone who doesn't see things exactly the same way that we do. And so the next time you are about to dismiss someone, and we all do more often than we know, pause and think of Yalta, of how unfairly she was dismissed, and give that person a hearing. You may not end up agreeing with them, and that's fine, but at least you will not have created another madwoman in the attic. Thank you. Okay, we have no time for clapping. Here's what we're going to do. There is 5 minutes. I'm very happy to take questions or comments for 5 minutes. If I don't get to you, please email me and we can continue the conversation by email. And if you want an autographed copy, you have 5 minutes to get one now and bring it to me. Yes. That is a fantastic question. That is what I write. That is the question I answer in the conclusion of the book. And very, very briefly, the rabbis want us to realize how easy it is to misunderstand. Because if we're misunderstanding the characters in the story, who knows what else in life we might be misunderstanding. And the way we have to read these stories becomes the way we have to read other people in our lives. And I kind of flesh that out in the conclusion of the book. Yeah. So I don't, it's one of the few typically feminine statements that I don't actually write about. No, I don't write about in the book, but there are different ways to understand it. It's actually a very, very long discussion. If you're interested, please write to me and we can have that discussion by email. Okay, I'm sorry, I do not have to, it's complicated. Hashtag it's complicated. Anything else? Yeah.
Feel like a similar dynamic in the Tanakh, the Torah.
As in similar dynamic.
Encountering and those who grapple with these women in the Talmud as something deeper, and there's not much reference of women.
So rabbinic and biblical storytelling. Sorry, I saw a thing pop up. Someone, Joan, in the system will have my email, and I'm sure they can email it out. So biblical and rabbinic storytelling have a lot in common. And it's because the rabbis are very influenced by biblical storytelling because they read a lot of Bible. But this whole idea of the false front, that is more uniquely rabbinic. Like stories that biblical stories have to be unpacked, but they're not as deliberately misleading as rabbinic stories are. And again, why that is, I kind of explain in the book in great detail. One more question. That's a very broad. There are wonderful works written about the portrayal of women in the Bible. It's far more complicated than that. I recommend Tikva Frimer's book because I think she does a really good job unpacking it. All right. Again, email me. I'm sorry, guys. I have to catch a plane. I have to sign a few books. But if I haven't answered anything, email me. I will answer you. It will tell me time, but I will.